Hello, everyone, and welcome back to SALT Talks. My name is John Darcy. I'm the managing director of SALT, which is a global thought leadership forum and networking platform at the intersection of finance, technology, and public policy. SALT Talks are a digital interview series with leading investors, creators, and thinkers. And our goal on these talks is the same as our goal at our SALT conferences, which we're excited to resume here in September of 2021. But that goal is to provide a window into the mind of subject matter experts, as well as provide a platform for what we think are big, important ideas that are shaping the future. And we're very excited today to welcome Sasha Issenberg to SALT Talks. Sasha is the author of 3 prior books, including The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He's covered presidential elections as a national political reporter in the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe. He's been a columnist for Slate and a contributor to Bloomberg Politics and Bloomberg Businessweek. He's the Washington correspondent at Monocle, and his work has also appeared in New York, the New York Times Magazine, and George, where he served as a contributing editor. He teaches in the political science department at UCLA, and a very smart man, lives in beautiful Santa Monica out in sunny California. His most recent book is called The Engagement, and it's about America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage. It's a fantastic, very thorough book on the subject, one that's very near and dear to our hearts, and one that Anthony, worked on personally along with Rob Reiner, which he'll talk about more as he gets into the talk. But hosting today's talk is Anthony Scaramucci, who's the founder and managing partner of Skybridge Capital, which is a global alternative investment firm. And with that, I'll turn it over to Anthony.
Well, I don't have a copy of the book with me, Sasha, because I'm out here in sunny California with you, but I have a picture on my phone. There you go. Hold up the book for everybody.
There it is.
So I received your book. I'm going to tell you my history with your book, because I love books. I received your book, and then I read the New York Times front page book review, which I thought was a fascinating review, and they gave you a great one. And when I read the book, I read Victory Lab prior, because I have obviously an interest in politics, despite my disastrous 11-day episodic event in politics. And I thought these books were conjoined. So we're going to get into your background in a second, but I'm going to tell you why they were conjoined. Because in Victory Lab, you wrote about the science of winning an election, but there was a scientific process in this book, in my opinion, in terms of the struggle to legalize same-sex marriage. In many respects, Sasha, I felt there was a political campaign going on at the same time, apropos to the civil rights campaign, corollary to that, but also there was a political campaign and an agenda and a quorum very similar to Victory Lab. Did I get that right, or did I miss something?
Yeah, I think that there are parts of this book which are very much, as you say, about innovation in campaigns, figuring out how to persuade people, how to target your persuasion, how to measure your persuasion, and then how to actually make it work in, what were often these state level ballot measure campaigns, which, you've been around a lot of candidate campaigns, and it's a very different beast when you have, a bunch of nonprofits and issue organizations coming together in a state like Minnesota to beat back a constitutional amendment. And so, I think that we tend to think of great campaigns as being candidate centric or party centric, but I think that, this sort of proves to be one of the great political campaigns of recent memory. And I think that'll be really surprising if we talked to somebody 15 years ago, because it seemed like such a loser of a cause, and that anybody associated with it, elected officials and the like, were sort of, doomed to be dragged down by it.
Well, I mean, there is a scenario here in New York, which I know you remember. Several hedge fund managers, Dan Loeb, et cetera, gave money to Republican state senators in New York to flip the marriage proposal, same-sex marriage. Those 4 Republican senators decided to vote for it. They all lost their elections. Okay, and that's only, I guess, 10 or 12 short years ago. Before we go completely into the book, though, I think your background is also fascinating. What was it like to work at George? Tell us a little bit about how you grew up. Why did you become a journalist? And then we'll delve more into the book, which I'm obviously fascinated by.
So I grew up in New York, in Westchester County, and I went to high school in the Bronx at the Horace Mann School. And I got lucky enough to end up at George Magazine when I was 15 years old as a basically unofficial summer intern. The magazine was it launched in September of 1995, and early that summer I got in. And one of the things about magazines pre-launch is there's a lot of work to do and nobody really knows who's supposed to do any of it. And it's quite possible they didn't understand child labor laws either. And so an editor told me that if I kept on coming in every day that summer, he couldn't pay me or give me anything official. They'd already hired their official, Ivy League interns, but I could make myself useful. And then, I guess like the common cold or herpes or whatever, I never went away. And
toe fungus. It's toe fungus, Sasha.
Okay.
I see myself as toe fungus. Once I'm in the toe, you can't get rid of me. But I hear you. So you were 15 when you started at George.
I was 15 when I started, and then I gradually got more responsibility doing some of my own reporting and little bits of my own writing and all sorts of things that were less glamorous. And I ended up being the only person who was with the magazine for its whole life. So it lasted about 5.5 years till it folded. And by the end, I was writing for the magazine and while I was in college. And it was, I think a lot about this as we look back on what's happened with politics in the last 25 years since John Kennedy launched the magazine. But I think he was, incredibly perceptive at noticing the ways that politics and popular culture were not just intersecting, but sort of becoming indifferentiable from one another, and the way in which the sort of political media sphere and the entertainment sphere were one and the same. And that was a pretty radical proposition to build a magazine around in the 1990s. And like the advertising environment didn't quite understand whether it was a political magazine or a pop culture magazine. But, I think often about how he would look at certainly the people who are national political figures now, let's say, and think that it might have been, a sort of natural arc from some of the stuff that we were seeing back then.
Do you think Joe Biden is the last of the political infrastructure figures to become president? And what I mean by that is President Biden became a senator in 1972. He went on to become president, but he was 49 years in the establishment infrastructure of the American political system. Do you think that we'll have celebrity presidents, apropos to Donald Trump or The Rock, or where do you think that's going from a genre perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump shows that there are far more shortcuts to the presidency than there used to be. I guess we could talk about whether Eisenhower took a shortcut or not. But I think that's clearly an example that you can build your profile, your sort of base of support outside of the political establishment and international politics at the highest level, and have a foundation for it. And I don't know, The Rock, Will Smith. People talk about Tom Brokaw running for president 20 years ago. It's all basically the same proposition. That said, I think we can look back at Biden's success as, and I think we've talked for years about how senators or lifelong politicians have a tougher job running for president because they have all this baggage and all these votes and 49 years of clips of things they've said. And you could also look at Biden's success last year as very much a testament to the fact that he had paid his dues with almost every part of the Democratic coalition. He, might not have been beloved by any part of the Democratic coalition, but was liked and trusted enough by just about all of them. And that was a testament to his longevity. Like, I don't know if there's ever like a Democratic fan base for Joe Biden, but you know what? When it came time to run for president, African Americans, he had sort of like, built a long record of labor unions, but he could raise money, LGBT community, and that was like, accumulated over years. And I think that there is, I wouldn't surprise me if we see other situations where parties turn to people like that because other candidates are flawed in their way. I think the question is, how many people are going to be in politics for 49 years? That's the other thing is we just don't see that many career politicians. We see, people sort of skedaddle when they can make more money, or they get frustrated in the Senate or whatever else. I'm not sure if we'll see many more lifers.
Well, it's just interesting. I wanted your perspective because I think you've had your hand on the pulse of this for a quarter of a century. So back to the book again, a fascinating book, The Engagement, about America's quarter century struggle over same-sex marriage. I saw the book as a layered cake. It had three tiers to it, in my opinion. I'd like to get your reaction to it. The first tier was the sentiment on the ground and people in our society, and obviously the biblical society, the Christian society, and others. That was tier one. The second tier was politicians, and to your point in the book, most of them, as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, didn't want to touch it with a hot, anything. It was hot stove to those people. Joe Biden, interestingly enough, was the first person on the national stage to really open up about it, ahead of Barack Obama, which is interesting. But the top of the cake to me were the court cases, because you had a series of court cases that had to frankly break your way or our way. I'm a same-sex marriage proponent, so I'll say our way. And I thought that was fascinating as well. And then, of course, you brought up the state legislature. I would think that's at the top of that cake. What's your reaction to my analysis of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not much of a baker, so my sense of cake architecture is a little wobbly. But I think I think you have the elements right. I think one thing is that the sort of causal chain, in a lot of cases, it was courts forcing politicians to address this issue. And so, my book starts in Hawaii in 1990. At that point, there's not a single gay rights organization in the United States that has endorsed marriage as an objective. There's barely a politician in the United States who's been asked his or her opinion on marriage. And there's obviously through the 80s, a lot of anti-gay activism on the religious right, but they're not trying to stop gay people from marrying because, they're trying to stop sometimes gay people from working as teachers, serving in the military, having employment non-discrimination protections. And it's a court case in Hawaii that ends up forcing just in Hawaii, the legislature and the governor to have to stake out a position on this. And we see versions of that in Vermont and Massachusetts. And eventually, part of what's driving, senators who are changing their position in 2013 is it's going to the Supreme Court. And so, I think that the legal, you're right that I think politicians were sort of followers of public opinion, but the thing that was driving this to the top of the agenda was often lawsuits, sometimes accidental, like in Hawaii, and sometimes sort of well-plotted civil rights test cases. But those are the elements. Yeah, I think that there's a ground level social change that took place, and then I think the legal stuff was sort of the direct engine, and then the political class had to respond to this. And for a long time, what same-sex marriage activists were trying to do was keep politicians out of this, because if their feeling was if we won in court, the only thing could be bad if a state legislature or a governor decided to amend the Constitution or try by statute or something to undo a court victory.
When you go back in your intellectual journey on this idea of same-sex marriage, let's start with Bill Clinton in 1996 in the Defense of Marriage Act. And then let's fast forward to 2012. To me, that's a pretty short period of time. If you think about the civil rights struggle from, say, 1865 to the introduction of Jackie Robinson in American baseball in 1947, it seems like this moved very fast. Why?
Yeah, and suffrage would be the other thing, right? We're looking at 75 years from Seneca Falls to women getting the vote nationwide. I think the biggest difference between the marriage, and I would separate here marriage as opposed to sort of the whole bundle of LGBT related issues, which has been a longer arc and still not won or settled. I think the big thing was that whether the majority or the people in with power didn't have to give anything up. And I think one way we often talk about sort of civil rights or social movements as these sort of contests over public ideals, justice, freedom, liberty, equality, stuff like that. It's also a way to look at it where they're basically contests over scarce resources. And when women decided to seek property rights, husbands and fathers appropriately recognized that they were going to lose wealth. When men saw that women getting the vote would dilute their own political power, white people saw that black people getting the vote would dilute their own political power. every push for immigrants' rights, native-born populations see it as a threat to their jobs. Desegregation was a threat to, landlords who didn't want somebody to tell them who they had to rent their buildings to. The disability rights, the ADA, burden landlords with having to spend money on repairs and adjustments. Every time to be more accepting or open, people had to give something up, often with a real material value to them. And the thing the sort of counterfactuals I like to play with is like, what if there were a limited number of marriage licenses in the state? Would somebody like you or some of those, straight hedge fund guys we mentioned, other sort of, the moderate straights who came around and supported this, like, if you knew that you or your child would have to wait 6 or 9 months in line for a marriage license because a gay person was now getting in front of him, would your views have changed? It might. And, the other way of asking it is sort of like, what if the defining LGBT rights issue of the last generation were affirmative action for gays and lesbians in areas where they thought they'd been discriminated against? This didn't really create a competition. And almost every other form of increased rights for a minority group creates a form of competition that's a threat to people who have wealth and power.
It doesn't create a competition. But for some reason, Sasha, and you correctly write about this in the book, there is a threat there for some reason. I don't know, is it a threat to someone's sexuality? Is it a threat to what people perceive normalcy, which I find ridiculous? That's, but I'm just letting you know that's a lot of people see it that way. How did we break down those ideas? I mean, we went from 30% of the people supporting gay marriage, 8 years later, 70% of the people. And we went from gay men and women being reluctant to admit that they're gay to an openly gay presidential candidate like Pete Buttigieg in 2020.
So I think on the marriage front in particular, May 17th, 2004 is the day that same-sex couples are able to first legally marry in the United States in Massachusetts. And the rhetoric shifts after that day in a really significant way. Before then, people who were opposed to same-sex marriage, and as you say, at that point, it's probably 65% of the population was opposed or such. And the things you heard from people, I think were, this is going to be the end of the American family. This is going to be the end of Western civilization. Rick Santorum said that, compared the Massachusetts court decision to 9/11, said it's a homeland security crisis. And, look, I think some of that was like natural hyperbole.
He's my spiritual advisor, Sasha.
Yeah.
I just want you to know that.
Okay.
Rick Santorum. No, he's not my spiritual advisor. I hope you didn't catch the sarcasm.
I've seen your list of bundling. I'm pretty sure that I didn't see you max out to Santorum.
No.
Look, some of that's hyperbole, like conscious hyperbole, and some of that I think people were really afraid of something that was new. And before 1999, there wasn't a society on earth that had allowed gay couples to marry, and it was a radical proposal. Everybody has, unlike a lot of political issues, I don't think there are a lot of people in the United States who are more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation from somebody who's married. This isn't abstract, it's real. And people had seen only one type of family structure that was acknowledged under the law. And I think people were really honestly afraid of what would happen. And what happens after Massachusetts, there are these incredible warnings of like societal decay. And what happens afterwards is nothing. And, there's obviously no outward, like, schools function the same way, businesses function the same way the day afterwards. This question of, that we heard over the years, from a gay or lesbian person, how would my marriage affect yours, becomes like a real challenge. And there's like nothing. And people are poring over statistics. Gay couples are not getting divorced at a higher rate. Their kids are not having worse outcomes. Their communities are no weaker or less strong. And if anything, what you start to see is that communities around gays and lesbians who are able to build a family on the same terms as straight people are stronger and better off. And you know what? Guess what? Their employers like it because they get predictability over who's going to get what benefits and what they get from the government and what they don't. Labor unions like it because now they can negotiate for benefits without having to come up with something crazy. Communities like it because they want full, stable families, and so part of what changes, I think, with time is that the coalition of people who are opposed to this starts to shrink because nobody is actually feeling any sense of harm. I mean, one of the major challenges for maintaining a political coalition on any issue is getting people who are actually invested in an outcome. And the group of people who are invested in stopping this shrinks. There's still people who believe that biblical, declarations of what's appropriate and godly, they haven't changed their views of this. But I think people who fear that somehow this would damage society don't have anything to lean on. And at the same time, you have the community of people who are invested in this spreading. And one thing that's different between we talked about the sort of efforts at equality over race and sex. Unlike with race and sex, people control the conditions under which they acknowledge and disclose and announce their sexual orientation, and for that matter, gender identity. And so people can come out and, almost by definition, gay people are born to straight people. And that means that, there are not a lot of, we know social scientists call it contact theory. We know that people's political attitudes change when they have exposure to somebody who's different than them.
But they're not. Senator Rob Portman's son came out. And
right.
Vice President Cheney's daughter came out, and all of a sudden their views started to shift.
And one thing that's important to realize, there's that's something that can happen because of how heredity and sexual orientation work. That's not something, there are not a lot of Latino kids being born to Jewish parents. There are not a lot of immigrant kids being born to native born parents. It's really important just to realize that, as best we understand, the odds of a gay kid ending up in any household in the country are pretty evenly distributed. And whereas racial segregation means that you're not likely to find out that your next door neighbor has been raising an African-American child all these years. And that just, exposes far more people to gays and lesbians, and I think probably transgendered people as well, than they would get exposed to people of a different race or religion, for example.
So this is an opinion question, but I'm curious because you have an informed opinion. Is there a stigma to being gay?
I mean, I think there certainly was in American society. I think it is greatly receding. I think some of it's local. If I'm a straight guy. If you told me I was a gay man and I had to decide where to start my life, there are probably certain places in the country and certain occupations or certain types of schools where I would feel more welcome than others. And I think that's a result of stigma. But
the good news is it's receding. The good news is that we're getting past it.
You mentioned Buttigieg. The fact that he was gay was not that interesting to people. People talk about he was young, he was mayor of a small city, who did he work for at Bain? It was not a defining part of his public identity. And I think that's pretty telling. A decade earlier, any gay man who ran for president, that would have been the defining aspect of their candidacy at every moment, I think.
Well, he's obviously he's a very impressive person. And I think that's where we have to get past, whether it's our sexual orientation, our skin color, our religious preferences, can you do the job or not? I think that's ultimately the thing that we have to look to. I have one last question for you before I turn it over to John Darcy. And I'm probably not going to pronounce the name right, but Carl Nassib. John, did I pronounce that right? I know you.
Nassib, yeah.
Nassib. He came out and he said that he was gay.
This is the Oakland Raiders player, or LA Raiders.
Yes, the LA Raiders player.
Yeah.
And the commissioner, Roger Goodell, a good guy, I might add, know him reasonably well. He applauded it, released a statement from the NFL. It was very well received. A couple of years back, Michael Sam came out, less so received. So is this another sign of progress in the fight for equality? Um, how do you think race factored into the reception of these athletes?
That's a great question.
These are
Yeah.
opinion questions.
I mean, I do think that you look at, I don't remember how long Michael Sam was 5 years ago. I mean, I think there's been a significant shift in that time. Some of it is, you mentioned the NFL as an organization. And one thing we have seen, Pride Month ended a few weeks ago, is institutional America, and that includes corporate America, becoming so unreserved in its not just acceptance of LGBT people, but in its sort of active support. And I think, companies falling over each other to be seen as allies or supportive, in part because they recognize that their employee base and their customer base and their investor base are want to see that, and they're responding to sort of market incentives. But I do think that some of this might be that organizations like the NBA or the NFL in this case are want to be seen as leaders on these type of social issues, and so you're getting it from the top down as opposed to just sort of from the community up. I mean, one thing that's worth, in terms of the sort of the decrease of stigma, I think it's really important to realize how our understanding of the science of sexuality has changed over this time. I went back and consumed a lot of media coverage from the 90s while researching this book. And like every time you read an article from Time or Newsweek about any gay rights issue, not just marriage, from the 1990s, there's like always a paragraph. It's like, to be sure, we don't know whether it's nature or nurture that turns people gay or lesbian. And, politicians, activists, preachers, whatever, would talk about lifestyle and choice, and nobody talks that way anymore. And it's because, downstream from laboratory research, we now have an understanding that basically people are born with a whole lot of stuff that they don't control. And that is not just related to sexuality, but temper, addiction. We talk differently about everything. And we, I think it's now widely accepted. Even the Rick Santorums of the world aren't going to pretend that Michael Sam or Carl Nassib or whoever it is chooses to be gay. And so then the question is, like, in a decent society, if people are being born this way, how do you respond to that? And, denying them the opportunity to have a job or play a sport would seem like a pretty harsh response to something if we sort of accept as a society that there will be gay people. So the question is, what type of society do we want to be to them?
John Darcy.
Yeah, and Sasha, it's a pleasure to have you on. Fantastic book you wrote. A lot of what you wrote about too in the book were colorful characters and consequential characters when it comes to this fight that obviously accelerated in the most recent decades. Could you just talk our audience through some of the people that you came across that you found most interesting and the role they played in this fight for marriage equality?
Yeah, sure, Don. So the book starts in Hawaii in 1990, and the main character there is this guy, Bill Woods, who I never got the chance to meet. He passed away a few years before I started working on this, but I was able to sort of, reconstruct his life and activities. He was like the gay activist in Hawaii in the 1970s and 80s. And like a lot of, I think, first generation activists in any sphere or community, he was, incredibly entrepreneurial. He founded the Gay Community Center. He started the gay newspaper. He had the first gay radio show in Hawaii, but not particularly good at building alliances or coalitions or working well with others. And very good about getting attention for himself, but not terribly good about playing well with others. And he ends up in this petty rivalry within a Pride planning committee in Honolulu in 1989. And he already has kind of has it out with these two lesbian women who are running this Pride planning committee because they have launched a magazine, Island Lifestyle, that competes with his Gay Community News for what John, you can only imagine is the large pool of advertisers in Oahu in 1989 who want to be in gay publications. And he wants to have a parade as part of the Pride planning festivities, and they just want to have a picnic and vigil. And so They give him a subcommittee to research the parade. He comes back with a report. They dismiss the report. So he decides he's going to quit their Pride Planning Committee and start his own Pride Parade Planning Committee. And now Bill Woods is looking for all these ways to upstage the picnic event. And so he invites the governor to be the grand marshal of his parade. He gets the Royal Hawaiian Jazz Band. He gets a chef, caterer friend of his to put on an international food festival. And he decides he's going to have a mass wedding, like a Mooney style, few dozen couples on stage at a rally at the end of this parade. And they're going to exchange vows. And there have been couples who've been doing this at the Metropolitan Community Church, which is a local gay-friendly, sort of ambiguously Protestant denomination, these Holy Union ceremonies, but people knew it had no force of law. They were just exchanging vows. Bill Woods was not a lawyer. It's pretty clear to me he misread the state's family law code. And he came away with the impression that if these couples actually exchange vows on stage, that the state might have to recognize them as married. And he went to the Hawaii ACLU to get them to back him up in this sort of legal theory. And they also, they wanted nothing to do with him, but they also didn't want to say no to him because they knew Woods well enough to know that if you pick a fight with him, he would, sort of revel in it and it wouldn't work out well. And so they spent all of 1990 just sort of like pushing him off, clearly trying to get past June 1990 when Pride Month would happen, hope that Woods would lose an interest in this marriage thing, go ahead with his parade or whatever, and move on to the next thing. And he didn't move on. The marriage ceremony didn't happen, but but now he was pissed that the ACLU had basically been stringing him along and disrespecting him. And so December 17th, 1990, Bill Woods decides he's going to launch this PR stunt, basically in his hopes to jam the ACLU into having to back him up. That once there's media coverage of this, there's no way that the ACLU can say no to actual gay couples who want to, fight for marriage rights. And so he gets like the Honolulu press corps to follow them into the public health department. These three couples request marriage licenses. They're turned down. The attorney general says that the health director was right under state law to reject them. Woods leads them to the ACLU with all these cameras. The ACLU still says, no, we don't want to be part of this. A civil rights attorney sues on these couples' behalf the next spring. And to the shock of everybody involved, this long shot lawsuit wins. And the Hawaii Supreme Court becomes the first court anywhere on earth to rule that the fundamental right to marriage could extend to same-sex couples in May of 1993. And this is what puts marriage on the map as an issue. The Defense of Marriage Act that Anthony mentioned in 1996 is Congress eventually feeling that Hawaii is very close to actually marrying same-sex couples, one trial judge away, and that you need to write it into federal law to basically insulate mainland governments, the other 49 states and the federal government from having to recognize these marriages. And so, Woods ends up being the catalyst for the world we live in right now. Like this would not have become the issue the way it did if he hadn't launched this. And he's both like just an amazing character, whom I wish I had the chance to meet, but also just I think sort of telling in our understanding of history, and that when something ends at the Supreme Court and we see a landmark decision that awards a set of rights to a new group of people, I think our natural instinct is to assume that because the outcome was momentous and just, that it had to be inevitable. And that's often the language we use around civil rights. And there's the fact is like this, nothing about this was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable it was going to end up at the Supreme Court when it did or turn out the way it did, but it also wasn't inevitable this was going to be a thing that we as a country were fighting over. And right. So I really liked him because it shows how accidental the sort of origins of this was.
Anthony referenced then Vice President Biden sort of taking the lead on marriage equality within the Obama administration. President Obama himself actually for a long time being opposed to marriage equality. Certainly the Trump administration, it was hard to discern exactly what their stance was, but they also enabled legislation or certain rulings that certainly didn't enhance the rights of the LGBTQ community, if you will. But could you just compare and contrast, what took place in the Obama administration, setting aside maybe his early, he was opposed to marriage equality at the beginning, obviously, and changed course there. But then within the Trump administration, what kind of setbacks did we see in terms of LGBTQ rights?
Yeah. So, Obama, as you say, Obama actually in 1996, when he first ran for the state Senate, said he supported same-sex marriage rights. Right. And then he later backed off and blamed a staffer for having filled out a questionnaire against his will. As he ran for Congress, he became basically more conservative on this issue. And he became where the mainstream of Democratic politics were through the 2000s, where Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton were, which is saying, some version of, I think marriage is between a man and a woman, but I think that gay couples should have all the same rights and benefits through civil unions. And it became clear through 2011, Obama sort of recognized he was going to be out of sync with his party on this. And I tell a story of him coming to New York for some DNC fundraisers in the summer of 2011, after Cuomo has signed the marriage bill into law. And I think I quote one of Obama's advisors saying he felt like the skunk at the garden party or whatever, which is, you sort of had the liberal donor class of the Democratic Party celebrating Andrew Cuomo for having sort of, muscled through what they saw as courageously muscled through this bill, and Obama being berated by activists for being on the wrong side of it. And so there was this process underway in the White House starting in the summer of 2011, where Obama said, basically, I want to change my position on this, but you guys, my team, need to figure out how and when I do it. And, I think that one of the things about being president is there's just such scrutiny of your every statement and your opinion that you can't just sort of casually change your position on something and hope no one notices the way you might be able to if you're a member of Congress or something. And so there was a sort of high level effort to figure out how to do this. There was a decision he should do it before November 2012, before the reelection, but you don't want to do it too late in the calendar because you don't want this, they wanted to run against Mitt Romney on private equity and the economy, and he did not want to spend the debates or his convention having to explain why he had flip-flopped on marriage. They thought it would be a net plus for him running for re-election, but they still did not want this to dominate the campaign. So there were all these plans afoot in the White House. And eventually they settled on the idea, should he give a big speech like the race speech he did in Philadelphia? No, that would make it more of an event than they wanted. So he'll do an interview. They decided he should do it with female questioners because there was research that suggested that from a messaging perspective, it's better that when you talk about this family stuff. And so they had plans, sort of tentative plans for him. He was going to be in New York in June for fundraisers. He was going to go on The View. So I guess the only thing better than one female interviewer is 4 female interviewers. And that's where Obama was going to lay out that he had evolved, as he liked to say. And Biden was aware of the general contours of this. And Biden basically jumped the gun a month early, said what he did, and it forced Obama 3 days later. One of the remarkable things, though, that's going on for a couple of years before that is that the White House counsel's office is, there's this question of what's Barack Obama's personal position on same-sex marriage. And it's kind of irrelevant what the president's personal position on same-sex marriage is, because there's never going to be a piece of legislation that comes before the president's desk about marriage to sign. Like, it's just not a thing that the president is going to deal with directly. But the White House and Justice Department have a lot of say in how the government, especially handles the Defense of Marriage Act, but also gets involved in other cases as they move into federal courts. And so what you see is actually the White House counsel's office, starting in 2009, getting ahead of Obama in his public position they eventually they say, we're going to stop defending the Defense of Marriage Act because we think it's unconstitutional, which is a really unusual position for the federal government to take, saying we're not going to defend our own laws in courts. Basically our whole system of constitutional litigation is based on governments have to defend their own laws. Otherwise, there's nobody there to do it. And so, it's one of these things, and, I don't know whether, Anthony, you spend enough days in there to get a good perspective on this, but there are a few different levels at which a White House can operate. There's what the president says publicly, and then there's what his government is doing. And Obama's government was always sort of more aggressive on this marriage question in courts than he was. I think the Trump years, Trump was always, he was very ambiguous about this throughout the election. He criticized the Supreme Court decision when it happened, the Obergefell decision in 2015 that made same-sex marriage a law of the land. But then he was interviewed by Leslie Stahl a couple days after the election in 2016, and he says it's settled law. I accept it. I think that there was a real disconnect between, Trump's attitudes towards marriage,
words and action.
Well, between on marriage, where he did not. I was surprised that this was not a bigger issue in the 2015-2016 election season among Republicans, because you had the Supreme Court striking down state bans in some of the reddest states. Bobby Jindal briefly said we should abolish the Supreme Court because of this. There was a moment where Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee went down to Kentucky where that county clerk, Kim Davis, was refusing to issue licenses. But for all of the ways in which Donald Trump, has an exceptional gift for pitting Americans against each other for his own amusement, political benefit, instinct, whatever, he did not seem interested in pitting gay couples who wanted to get married against his base. Like, that's just was not his thing. That said, I don't think that, I think there's a real difference between how certain parts of the Republican conservative world now look at gay and lesbian concerns and transgender issues. And, Rick Grenell, who is probably the administration's leading voice on sort of what gay republicanism should be, seems pretty intent on kind of splitting the LGBT coalition between gay men and lesbians and maybe bisexuals on one side, and then, people dealing with gender identity issues. And so, the Trump administration on a rulemaking level was set back LGBT rights in a lot of areas, but there wasn't a whole lot that it chose to do or really directly could have done on marriage.
So you talked about the Supreme Court, and this will be the last question before we let you go. Is Neil Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion last summer in a workplace discrimination lawsuit, Bostock versus Clayton County. He basically ruled that you cannot fire someone, you probably are more familiar with this case even than I am, on the basis of sexual orientation. It falls under the sex category. And that surprised a lot of people. There's been various rulings from the Supreme Court when Trump's appointees have been sitting in those chairs that have surprised people, and sometimes to the consternation of certain elements of the Republican community. How surprising was that decision? How important was that decision in terms of, ridding ourselves of certain workplace discrimination?
So I think it was really important just in the lives of people. There's still 13, 14 states that permit a company to fire somebody because they're gay or lesbian, or not hire them or not promote them. There's been efforts for almost 50 years, but in earnest for 30 years, to pass a federal law that would codify making that illegal. And it hasn't gotten through the Senate ever. So this is important and creates conditions for folks in a lot of those states to bring federal actions. Now, it just dealt with employment. There's still a question about housing discrimination, lending discrimination. In a lot of those states, you could choose not to rent something to somebody because of their sexual orientation. You can deny them a mortgage. You can turn them away from your diner or a hotel. And so, Bostock, the logic of Bostock could apply to those other areas, but the actual decision did not. Now, it's important to look at how Gorsuch wrote that, the reasoning behind that. So basically, he calls himself a textualist. That means that you look at the text of, in this case, of a law, of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, and it says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, sex, blah, blah, blah. And his interpretation was that, well, traditionally, or in the past, we've understood sex to mean biological sex. Sex should be understood to mean sexual orientation. And that just based on that definition of the word sex, that employment discrimination against somebody because they're a woman is the same in legal terms as discriminating against them because they're a lesbian. It's notable that wasn't a civil rights decision. it was a momentous decision, but it was narrowly applied to that, which is, Anthony Kennedy also, who was behind, 4 major gay rights decisions, also was resistant to kind of traditional civil rights thinking. And that meant that even when there was a way that he could have written the marriage decision that would have affected other areas of interest to LGBT folks under the law, and didn't. And Gorsuch's, one irony, I mean, maybe it's not an irony of I don't think this is necessarily his strategic plan, but what Gorsuch did was he left it open. It wasn't a matter of constitutional interpretation. It was just a matter of interpreting the text of that bill. And it's possible that if you had a Republican House and Senate and President Mike Pence in a few years, that they could amend with a majority in the House and whatever gets you through the Senate these days, the Civil Rights Act, to say biological sex and overrule the Supreme Court. And so by not making it a matter of constitutional guarantee and just making it a matter of statutory interpretation, it was flimsier than it could have been. And so, I think you're right to note that was a surprise coming from a conservative justice, but it's also the getting there was, notable for what it chose not to do, and,
Right.
and made it possible to get a majority, I think, of votes on that.
Right. Well, the struggle is ongoing. Again, the book is The Engagement: America's Quarter-Century Struggle Over Same-Sex Marriage. A fantastic topic to write about and extremely well written. Sasha, thank you so much for joining us. Anthony, you have a final word for Sasha before we let him go?
What's next, Sasha? What book are we writing?
I've gotten very interested in a historic election fraud scandal that took place in Indiana over 100 years ago that I think is just a hell of a true crime yarn, and also shed some light on the conversations we're having now about the nature of election fraud and to what extent it exists or has existed in American history. So
all right, well,
it'll be shorter, and I promise not to spend. It won't be 900 pages, and I won't spend a decade on it. That's my guarantee to you.
Well, we appreciate it. This has been a great conversation for us. Sasha, if you don't mind, hold up the book, because mine is in New York. I want to hold it up again for everybody. The Engagement. What a great story about America's quarter-century struggle over the same-sex marriage. Thank God we're through that struggle, by the way. I think it's great for our society. I appreciate you writing that book, and hopefully we'll get you to one of our live events soon.
I'd really like that. It's great talking to you, Anthony. Nice to meet you, John.
You as well. And just another piece of trivia before we wrap up here. President Joe Biden spoke at the SALT conference in 2017. He came there along with the Human Rights Campaign. So it's certainly encouraging to see somebody with a very proactive view of marriage equality, just general equality. So we continue to hope that arc bends towards equality for everyone. But thank you, Sasha. And thank you, everybody, for tuning into today's SALT Talk with Sasha Issenberg. Just a reminder, if you miss any part of this talk or any of our previous SALT Talks, you can access them on our website at salt.org/talks, or on our YouTube channel, which is called SaltTube. We're also on social media. Twitter is where we're most active at SALT Conference, but we're also on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook as well. And please spread the word about these SALT Talks if you find them interesting. But on behalf of Anthony and the entire SALT team, this is John Darcy signing off from SALT Talks for today. We hope to see you back here again soon.